In the aftermath of the terrorist attack that killed over 140 people in Russia, the country's president has said evidence points to the involvement of Ukraine. This is despite claims of accountability from Islamic State-linked militants. More people have been arrested in relation to the attack last week. To discuss this, we're now joined by political analyst Musa Mdunge. Musa, good to speak to you and trust you're having a great Easter. You're speaking to us from Dundee in Scotland. Now let's talk about the evidence that Russia claims to have linking the perpetrators of the Moscow concert hall attack to the Ukrainian nationalists.
Thank you so much, Hugo. Good afternoon to you and to your viewers. Well, essentially, you know, the evidence that Russia is going about is the very fact that these particular perpetrators of this terrorist act were seen fleeing towards Ukraine, and under observation, some have confessed to the fact that they received some sort of support, be it intelligence or military support from the Ukrainian government. But of course, what we know is the United States have come in, excuse me, and have declared that Ukraine is not involved in this particular matter, and rather we need to locate the perpetrators within that greater nexus that is happening in the Middle East, where we have seen ISIS insurgency groups in places like Afghanistan, in places like Syria creep up. And we know the Russian involvement in those countries in dealing with the terrorist insurgencies that have taken place, and as well as propping up authoritarian governments in those particular countries. And therefore, Russia having been linked to what is happening in the Middle East and the geopolitical ramifications that stem from that, one can argue that Russia's evidence on Ukrainian involvement is not substantial, and the links are very weak at this point. And what it seems to me is Putin is simply trying to carve out a legitimacy out of this particular terrorist attack in order that he may consolidate his power. And that is the key, because what we must remember is Russia is the state. What we must remember is Putin is the state and the state is Putin. And fundamentally, this is the issue here. How does Russia consolidate power around Vladimir Putin?
Okay, so I want to rewind a little bit and look at the amount of intelligence that was available to Russia prior to the incident. Now, what we know for a fact is that the United States did raise the alarm. In fact, I think anything up to 10 days prior to the attack, and said that this was likely to happen. There was going to be an attack on Russia. Did Russia not take heed to this? What were the challenges in their security apparatus in identifying that there was an impending attack?
Well, this is the curious chat, right? The Russians, having received this intelligence from the United States, where, by the way, these countries have a bilateral agreement, but also established within a multilateral framing of sharing intelligence, particularly with the endeavor of doing no harm first. And this is the reason why intelligence has been shared between these countries. Perhaps, Hugo, that the third reason to why Russia would ignore such intelligence is because there is a belief by some within the intelligence sector, some political analysts, that these terrorist attacks are manufactured within Russia. And so rather than receive and acknowledge the intelligence they receive from the United States and act on it, there was a decision to rather reduce the level of security around Russia and around that particular event, in order that this particular terrorist attack could happen, and by virtue then, there would be what we call the rallying around the flag, rallying around Russia, rallying around Vladimir Putin, and in essence, legitimizing his power and his claim to being a man who can ensure Russian security and stability. So fundamentally, it is this third reason, Hugo, that I present to you as being at the core to why Russia would ignore U.S. intelligence, regardless of that bilateral agreement that these countries both have.
But you talk about curious, and it's equally curious for me, because whether I believe in the U.S., I like them or not, surely I should act on some form of intelligence, particularly if it's an impending terrorist attack? I mean, I don't have to go out and tell the whole world that we are reacting or that we are upping the security measures.
Certainly, you don't have to do that, and I do agree with you. It is quite curious to see the Russian reaction, but it's about understanding what Russia is, right? In many ways, Western leaders who've had to deal with Russian and Soviet leaders have often been curious about what Russia truly is. And the problem is many of these countries are trying to democratize this particular country, are trying to impose democratic values of freedom and peace and human rights to a country that doesn't necessarily uphold these rights as most fundamental to the core of its existence. This is why Russia would ignore so great an intelligence as it had received from the United States. It is because of this that fundamentally they did not trust American intelligence. Secondly, perhaps they had a buy-in and a stake in these attacks happening in order that they may consolidate power around Vladimir Putin in a time, by the way, Hugo, where Russia has just gone through presidential elections.
Now, what is the significance of the detainees from Tajikistan in relation to the attack? And I suppose the immediate question thereafter is, what intelligence has been received from those that have been detained? Do we have any information that may point to anybody else other than ISIS that is responsible for this attack?
At this point, no. At this point, no, because the submissions made, the testimonies made by the accused points very much towards ISIS as being the perpetrators of this particular act. And so what we will not see is any fingers being pointed or directed to Ukraine. Now, what is curious about the nationality of these particular men being this particular country is that this country, of course, shares Soviet links with Russia. And these particular links have allowed Tajikistan to be a feeder nation, feeding terrorist insurgency groups in Russia, supporting these groups of financing and military support. And this is the challenge that we have. In essence, what we are seeing, Hugo, are the consequences of the failure to conclude the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So fundamentally, what Francis Fukuyama said, that we are existing in the end of history, it turns out that that is not the case, that we still have to account about the decisions that were taken and those not taken. And this is why Vladimir Putin still stands, and the reason why Democratic presidents, Republican presidents will come and go, but Russia in the form of Vladimir Putin will continue to stand because of such countries and the legitimacy that they feed Russia and Moscow particularly.
Musa, I want to touch a little bit on the ability of the security apparatus in superpower-type countries. We go back to that event on October 7th last year, where the Mossad failed to pick up on the fact that Hamas was going to attack Israel as a start. A few months later, we are in Russia, we are in Moscow, and this event again has happened, highlighting the lapse, if you will, in security apparatus in these respective countries. What do we read into this? Does it speak to the intelligence, certainly of ISIS or Hamas, or is it just really a lapse in security in these respective countries?
Well, Hugo, it does not speak to the intelligence of groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab. What it actually speaks to, rather, is the intelligence of Mossad, the intelligence of, the FSB, the intelligence of the intelligence of these countries, because these particular countries are seized rather with agitating towards conflict rather than a resolution of conflict. So rather than act on intelligence received both from your allies as well as those that you would count as foes, they choose rather to ignore this intelligence in order to make reality the very steps they need to justify the war that they are imposing on the world. And so in many ways, when you hear the response of the Israeli government, when you hear the response of the Russians, fundamentally what we are seeing is countries that are unable to appreciate the rights of others for self-determination and territorial sovereignty. And this is why rather than act on intelligence, we ignore it in order that we may continue to perpetuate human rights violations. This, Hugo, I would put to you, is the core of why we find ourselves where we find ourselves.